Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony imaging ambassador. Now, Sony don't ask me to make these videos, and they certainly don't pay me to make them. So the views you're going to hear about the Alpha 1 camera are all my own impressions of the camera. Now, I'm not here to put out an advert for the camera. I'm here just to basically showcase what the camera is capable of, to help you better work out whether this camera is something that you need to pre-order, or maybe just wait for the features to roll down to future cameras, maybe later this year or next year. Now, I am going a little bit earlier than I normally would with this camera review. Normally I would wait until I was processing the raw files before releasing my video, but my inbox has been overwhelmed with people asking questions about whether the camera really can do this or whether it really does do that, and that is because people have been listening to a lot of other people's reviews, camera reviewers who have gone very early to get the increased number of likes, to get the extra Google advertising basically, and so I need to go early just to put some of those questions to rest. Presenting the shocking evidence, there's nothing really shocking about this video. I'm just surprised how many people use the word shocking in the video title to get people to watch these videos. Fake news, bad reviews. I also want to touch on those subjects as well in this review. Now, I would like you to watch this movie in 4K on a large screen if possible. So just adjust your browser settings, your YouTube settings, so you've got that 2160p setting there. Now that may take a good internet connection so you can play this movie, but I'm going to be showing a lot of photographs, and that in itself is a bit unusual for a camera reviewer. Now, I'd also encourage you that if you think I'm talking a little bit slowly, just increase the playback speed to 1.5 times. I can only talk as fast as I can think, so you might just want to speed me up. Other people have said that they don't actually like seeing my face in the little corner. Now, I have to say that for 90% of the camera reviewers, if you took away their face, you'd be looking at a black screen for most of the time. So what I'd encourage you to do is just put a sticky note over my face if you want to look at the photographs and you don't want the distraction of my talking head. Truth or hype? Now, obviously there was an advert on the announcement of the Alpha 1 by Sony. I did not know what was coming when the Sony Alpha 1 was released. I thought the one never seen was referring to a curved sensor in an RX camera, and we couldn't see it because you couldn't remove the fixed lens on those cameras, so I was completely wrong. So I've had to do this testing of the camera at very short notice. I was not given any advantage over general camera reviewers, and that does put me a little bit behind the eight ball in getting this camera review up and out to give people accurate and well informed information. Now, there are going to be 6 topics that I want to cover, and I'll try and put links so you can jump ahead or backwards to some of these topics that I'm going to be covering. Number 1, image quality, resolution and dynamic range, because we've got a 50 megapixel sensor and we've got an extra stop of dynamic range. That's the ability to capture rich detail in the brightest of highlights and the darkest of shadows. Now, the stacked sensors in the A9 cameras were a little bit down on dynamic range compared to the backlit illuminated sensors of the A7 cameras, and Sony are claiming they've closed that gap on that one. High ISO performance. Now, we've always had good high ISO performance on the 24 megapixel cameras and even on the A7R2 and A7R3. Now, it's not bad on the A7R4, but a lot of people don't like the amount of noise on that Alpha 7R4 at high ISO, so I'm going to be looking at that one in detail. Frames per second. Now, that 30 frames per second that Sony are advertising is going to be a variable depending on whether you've got fast focus motors in your lenses, your focus mode, your focus area, etc., etc. So I'm going to be looking at that because some people can't hit the 30, but I can. So AF tracking, including animal, human and bird eye AF. Now, many a bird photographer has captured birds in flight with the A9 cameras without bird eye AF, but it's a feature that a lot of reviewers want to talk about, so I'm going to have to cover that in some detail. Now, I have to say it's not a detail that I would possibly not buy the camera for, because that will improve with later firmware upgrades, just as it did with the A7 III, A7R III, and backdated to the Alpha 9 camera in 2019. So, image size, and does it impact negatively on fast workflows? An important topic for maybe sports, photographers and photojournalists. And number 6, user error, recording 8K movies and overheating. I'm going to dive in with number 6, not take them in order, because if you are going to dial out of this movie too prematurely, I do want to point out that I couldn't get the Alpha 1 to overheat. Now, a lot of people were emailing me saying, Mark, does the camera overheat? And I looked at a couple of reviews very quickly, and they couldn't get the camera to overheat as well. But because somebody did, I had to test this. Now, what I do suspect is the person who managed to get this camera to overheat probably had the heater and the camera of their house in close proximity before they ran the test. That's the only thing I can come up with. So I shot test movies in 8K, 4K at a high frame rate. Now I'm quoting 100 frames per second. If you're in the USA, that'll be 120 frames per second, because we use different frames per second in different regions. And also running it at the standard frame rate, I'm using 25 frames per second. You'd be running it at 24 or 30 in the US. And just to see if I could get the camera to overheat in any of those. First one, 8K. I'm recording it to a CF Express card Type A. It's an 80 gigabyte card. Basically, it ran and it ran and it ran until the card was full, and then it stopped recording. I didn't even get a warning that the camera was getting hot. We're in a southern hemisphere summer here, so it wasn't cold, and the temperature was warm, 22 degrees centigrade, 71 degrees Fahrenheit. I had the flippy screen just pulled out a little bit, which I know helps dissipate the heat a little. So I ran additional tests. I used to wait about 15 minutes before starting the next test. So high frame rate. It recorded for 36 minutes 23 seconds. That's 2.5 hours playback if you play it back in slow motion, which is why you're typically recording in that high frame rate. Again, card filled, no overheating. Next, I chose the standard frame rate, which is 25 frames per second. I let it run. I went and had my lunch. It was still running when I got back from my lunch. 1 hour, 11 minutes, 52 seconds. The card filled and it stopped recording. So no overheating. Now, if you're saying, why didn't you test it with a 256 gigabyte card? I can't really understand why anybody would want to record a 200 gigabyte 8K file and then try and edit it. I simply do not have the computer power to edit such long 8K movie footage. Now, in Sony's launch of the Alpha 1 camera, they showed case 1 the dynamic range, and they used this image. This is not my image, this is one of Sony's images, and they said also 15 stop dynamic range. I immediately thought, why are they using this image to showcase dynamic range? Because the dynamic range would happily fit into a 14 stop full frame sensor. No issues there. We've got slightly low light. We don't have any bright white tones catching the sunlight, so it's basically not an issue. What you would normally expect as an indication of dynamic range is a shot like this, shooting into the light. So you got some really deep shadows from maybe in a landscape situation. And the ability of a sensor with a really high dynamic range is to be able to recover the highlights and shadows in post and have a file with absolute stunning quality. And I have to say, this is one of the Sony's fortes. The full frame backlit illuminated sensors certainly have shadow detail in high quality. Now Nikon's also share this for the only reason that Sony make the Nikon sensors. Canon's, it's a little bit patchy out there. Some of the sensors are okay with the shadow tones being lightened by 2 or 3 stops. Some of them it just looks perfectly awful, or should I say shocking. Okay, so basically just get a review on different cameras if that's important. If you're going for the 8K but you need high dynamic range, also check on what those shadows look like after they've been recovered by 3 stops in post. Because I can only access the JPEG files at the moment, the way I could test dynamic range is choose somebody with wearing black fabrics or black hair, get them to wear white top in the sunlight, and then we will start getting the dynamic range up. And you can see in this particular shot I have absolutely no problem fitting the brightest highlight tones on that white tunic and getting full fabric texture detail and full detail in the black hair. So perfectly good, and I expect the raw files to showcase that we do indeed have that extra stop dynamic range. What you're also looking at with this picture of Jimmy here is I've cropped in to 4K to showcase IAF. Now I'm not using the human IAF with somebody standing still. This person is in absolute full flight. Obviously that is an advantage of human IAF when we're doing that. So many of the reviewers are taking static portraits or people running around slowly. You want to put that in a sports action context, really, to be honest. Okay, so there you can see Jimmy, or should I call it Jimmy IAF, performing really well and absolutely pin sharp eyes there. Now this is Magra, a wedge-tailed eagle. She's in a sanctuary. You can see the tags around her legs and also the GPS tracking. Before you send in a word telling me that I shouldn't photograph birds in zoos, this is a sanctuary. Magra was born in the wild and was rescued, so if it wasn't for the sanctuary she would not be alive today. She comes out and flies for visitors to the sanctuary twice a day. If she feels like not coming back home for a couple of days, that is her prerogative, and this is something that she does choose to do periodically. So she does have the freedom to fly away. What you can again see there is beautiful pin sharp eye, so obviously that is locked on. Now I will say with bird eye AF it's in and out, it's not on all of the time, especially with birds flying as quickly as this, but any assistance with focus is something that I will take, and I know it will get better with future firmware upgrades. It's basically, let's not take away from the meat and potatoes of this camera, which is the sensor technology and the Beyond's X processors moving data quickly. You will not need to buy a new camera just to get improved algorithms for machine learning or AI learning to get better performance if you are leaning on human, bird, animal IAF. Okay, so moving forward, we can see the resolution there. Being an 8K sensor, you can easily, comfortably take 4K files. You could take 4 4K files from that sensor. Now, most people, the biggest they'll see an image displayed is on a large 4K monitor. And that would also translate to a double page spread in a magazine. So you can see how much freedom for cropping in post. Some reviewers say you don't need 50 megapixels, but I don't print big that often, but I do crop aggressively quite often, and so having a high resolution sensor can certainly be valuable in some instances. And to showcase this, I've got an image that I captured with the Alpha 7R3, a 42 megapixel sensor. You can see that 4K crop coming in there. I'm using a 400mm prime lens, so I can't zoom closer, I can't walk closer. It's crop this much, or basically have a smaller bird in the frame. So this croppability, I'm going to use that as a word, certainly comes in useful a lot on these high resolution sensors, and that's why many people who currently own the A9 cameras and like to shoot birds will be interested in the Alpha 1. It does have that croppability above and beyond, say, an A9 or Alpha 9 II camera. So there we have that 4K crop. Now this is at 2,500 ISO, which is often the case if we're using 1/2000th of a second to freeze a bird. You see that we haven't quite frozen the flapping wings there, but we've certainly frozen the body of this owl in flight. So the high ISO performance of a camera like the A7R3 was really quite good at high ISO. Maybe not as good as A7 III, but we do have that extra resolution. And this is where some people with the Alpha 7R4 were a little bit disappointed, because the high ISO performance wasn't quite as good as the Alpha 7R3. Now, I didn't think I would be showing you a portrait in this Alpha 1 review. I was thinking action, sports, fast-moving stuff. But I'm going to show you this portrait. This is the full resolution 50 megapixel file. I'll give you a link in the info below so you can zoom in on this file yourself. I'm going to save you a little bit of time here and zoom in on Beau's eyes. Now, I got one question via email saying, Mark, is it true that the Alpha 1 forward focuses on the eyes and photographs the eyelashes instead of the iris? I'm going, what? I really don't understand. This is photographed with a 135 full frame sensor, shallow depth of field, photographed wide open. The idea with a wide aperture lens is to blur the background. If you're working with a depth of field where you have to choose the eyelashes, the iris, or the eyebrows, then you're standing too close, or you haven't stopped the aperture of the lens down enough. Okay, it's basically a very silly question. As you can see in Beau here, the iris is sharp, the eyelashes are sharp, the eyebrows are sharp, just as it should be. And so the whole question about is the camera photographing on the eyelashes or iris? If you're working with a depth of field which is 3 millimeters thick, you have to question your technique. Okay, and so I really don't understand that debate. I dare say it's in some review movie somewhere that I can't be bothered finding, but it's a very silly question. Okay, so hopefully I've addressed that one. High ISO performance. Okay, we've looked at that croppability, we've looked at the resolution that affords that croppability. Now let's look at the high ISO performance. Now obviously I don't have access to the raw files again. You do get access via the Imaging Edge app, but I am going to wait for the Adobe software or Capture One software to allow me to open these Alpha 1 files. But this is ISO 8000. Okay, I need that 8000 because I'm shooting with 1/2000th of a second in low ambient light with the aperture wide open on the FE 200/600 G lens. So you can see the animal IF is certainly working well here, because you can see the nose on this dog is slightly blurry and the eyes are sharp. So animal IF is working quite well. This is actually captured from a sequence of over 100 frames, all I have to say sharp. So this is Penny, a Sheltie dog, and you can see that it's performing really quite well at high ISO. I have to say the high ISO noise reduction is set to standard in the camera. And there's Penny's mate, Rafiki, also at ISO 8000, and you can see we're getting beautifully crisp, sharp detail in the hairs coming off the side of the head there. So that's what often happens with ultra high ISO. We start losing fine detail, but I'd have to say there's enough here. There is no additional noise reduction applied in post-production, so that is zeroed out in Lightroom. So I've taken the JPEGs in, I've set a white point, a black point, just raised the saturation slightly, and that's pretty much all I've done. No additional noise reduction. So what I decided to do was to get an idea of how much noise is being removed by the camera. I switched off the high ISO noise reduction and went to some dogs moving a little bit faster. These dogs are coming towards me at, I am led to believe, at 70 kilometers per hour, which I believe is somewhere over 40 miles per hour, correct me if I'm wrong. So and I'm looking in the areas of smooth bokeh, the out of focus, the defocus areas, and there is noise there, but remember, no noise reduction in camera, no noise reduction in post. So I could easily manage that very small amount of noise on this file. You do have the option of going to the full 8K file for this image just by following the link in the info section below the movie. Now obviously with sports photographers working with those primes, they're not able to zoom in and out. You crop in when you need to zoom in, and so here is a high ISO image, 1250 ISO cropped into 6K. So now this is I'm getting a 24 megapixel file from the 50 megapixel file. I'm looking at that noise again, which should be magnified slightly as we zoom in or crop in, but again you can see that's well under control. This is the Greyhound track at night, and what we can see now is noise because the ISO has risen to 20,000 ISO. There is no noise reduction in camera, there is no noise reduction in post. I don't know whether this compares well with an Alpha 9 II camera or not, but certainly it's manageable. And I will come back and I'll give you more information at these ultra high ISO values when I've had chance to look at those raw files. Okay, so certainly up to 8,000, 10,000 ISO I was more than happy. The noise is starting to become more noticeable now. Okay. A little word about noise, because I know there are some Alpha 7R4 owners looking at the high ISO performance, thinking about making a switch perhaps to the Alpha 1. Now, I don't think the noise is as bad as some people make out with the Alpha 7R4. So I don't want you upgrading to an Alpha 1 before you watch this next little segment, if you like. Now I have to say the Alpha 1 certainly looks like it's got better high ISO performance than an Alpha 7R4. In fact, I'll state that now. The A1 does have better high ISO performance than the Alpha 7R4, and I know that even before I look at the raw files. But I just wanted to show you this ISO 2500 image that I captured at the beginning of the COVID when we had a couple of stranded cruise liners in my hometown port. Okay, so this is 2500. This is the full image, not cropped in. But if we take that in and we zoom to 100% in Lightroom, and we haven't done any processing, the noise will look like this. And this is where a lot of the debate with the Alpha 7R4 comes from. You zoom in, you go, whoa, look at the noise. Is there something wrong with my camera, etc., etc. So I just wanted to showcase some issues with how Lightroom is presenting this file to you. First off, I would get you to zero the texture, clarity, dehaze sliders, because those will overemphasize noise. Make sure sharpening isn't above the default of say 40 in Lightroom if you're working with high ISO noise images. Also raise that masking slider. This hides the sharpening being applied to the defocused or smooth bokeh areas where noise is most noticeable. And then add +20 noise reduction, and then your image will look like this. Okay, already that noise is looking a lot more manageable. You can also see I've zoomed out. Now zooming out I think is important. Now a lot of people who have 4K monitors who are scaling their view so they get text on screen that they can actually read in emails, etc., or in software for that matter, when you zoom to 100%, you might actually be zooming the image to 200% because Lightroom is confused. You've still got a 4K monitor, but I'm just showing you here that I do scale my 4K BenQ 32-inch monitor, and if I need to show the image at 100%, I actually have to zoom to 50% to show that. So a lot of you who are looking at very noisy images, I suspect, have zoomed to 200%, not 100%. Now just remember, no one is zooming in on your 4K images when you share them to social media. So it is the pixel peeping opportunity that some people have to think that their problem is actually greater than it actually is. Okay, on to number 3. We'll leave the ISO behind and we'll move over to frames per second. Again, I've had messages via social media and via email saying, Mark, I've heard that Sony are lying about their 30 frames per second. It's not actually possible. Well, that is user error in some of the camera reviewers who are simply not used to setting up Sony Alpha cameras. Now I release 450 page ebooks on the Sony cameras and video tutorials about action settings, etc., to help people understand the right group of settings in order to get the maximum performance when shooting fast action sports images. Okay, so I had to test this again. So I know the camera's firing off like crazy. You can actually have the shutter completely silent because the nature of shooting with a fully electronic shutter does mean that any noise when you're shooting sports action is optional. That certainly puts an advantage for an Alpha 1 for a sports photographer who's having to work quite close to somebody playing sports, such as a golfer who doesn't want that noise of 30 frames per second on a mechanical shutter. So what I've done here, this is the first image of a series of 100 and the last in a series of 100, and this was captured over 4 seconds precisely. I had to look at the fractions of seconds on this one to make sure that I'm being accurate here. And so what we've got is 25 frames per second using the FE 200/600 GOSS. Now this doesn't have the fastest XD dual linear XD focus motors, so one of the reasons we're getting a little bit of downgrade from the 30 frames per second is the lens isn't the best sports lens that Sony make, but we're only losing 5 from that 30. Another reason that other reviewers will lose more frames is because priority set in AFC for sports photography is set to release. You want all of the frames. A picture editor would rather take an image that's slightly out of focus rather than not have the decisive moment at all. There have been several reviewers switching priority set in AFC to AF, to focus, and so they're dropping frames in a sequence and then accusing Sony of lying about the maximum frame rates. Now I've been doing this for a couple of years. I've been stopwatching on 8 frames a second, 10 frames a second, 11 frames a second, and I always get what Sony are claiming by just setting priority set in AFC to release. Now some reviewers are only just catching up to this 2 years later after I've been promoting this as something that you need to do if you want the maximum frames per second. If you do prefer to drop the occasional frame because the camera thinks it's out of focus, then by all means set it to balanced emphasis or AF, but then don't complain about the lack of frames per second. The chances are with an Alpha 9 you will get all of them in sharp focus anyway, and this is what I'm also finding with these dogs running with the Alpha 1. They're all sharp, so certainly release is a very good setting if you want all frames in the sequence. Now I've also shot with these same settings with a faster focusing lens, which is the 135 G Master lens, which does have the dual linear XD focus motors, and with that lens I was getting 26.666 recurring frames per second, so we're getting a little bit of a bump, but that's still not 30. So when are we going to see that 30? And one reviewer, again I was told, said you need to switch autofocus off, which is absolute nonsense. Again, that's just unfamiliar with these Sony cameras, which is okay for somebody who's new to Sony, but not okay for a reviewer who has been testing these cameras over and over again and missing settings. So here is the 30 frames per second, this time 240 frames, and it's an 8-second burst, and if you do the maths, it's 30 frames per second. Now what I've done is I've come out of tracking and I've just gone into AFC wide. Now you don't always have to be using tracking as a sports photographer. Wide will nearly always nail the shot that you're looking for. So tracking for some photographers is something that you use occasionally. You don't have to use tracking when it's not needed. So if you're prioritizing frames per second, don't use the tracking option, and you'll likely as not just get the 30 frames per second and all of the subjects will be sharp anyway. For instance, these birds in flight, wide would get these. You don't need tracking. The subject is large, it's close to the lens, it's reasonably central. The Sony cameras will always go for this subject. You don't need to spot it with a spot focus point or a center fix focus point. I don't really know why some people choose slightly weird focus settings, or some people claim that there is only one focus setting that they use when Sony have got many focus modes and many focus areas to choose from. So there's my hero shot at the bottom, obviously the claws extended, about to grab something in midair, and there we go in. And I did say this in the preview, if this camera was going to live up to what I'm showing you here, this is what I've evidenced, then really this is something I'm not going to hesitate buying for my own workflow. Now if you're already achieving this with an Alpha 7R3 or an Alpha 9, then there's no real need to duplicate what you can already do. But I actually like the high resolution, and I like the fact that it can track this eagle, and the whole sequence is sharp. Now human IF, okay, now this has just been getting better and better over time. I know when it first came out, if somebody turned sideways to the camera, it would lose the eye. Then it started doing it in profile view, then it started doing it with tracking enabled, and it's just got better and better, and now it is exceptionally sticky. And I would expect the same to happen with Animal IF. Now when Animal IF first appeared on the Alpha 7 cameras, you couldn't actually use it combined with tracking, but now you can. So again, these algorithms, these machine learning, keep getting better, and they don't need new components in your camera to enable this. Basically they can be just given to you by firmware upgrades, and I would fully expect that to happen with the Alpha 1. I would expect that Bird IF, for instance, will get better over time. So this is ISO 800, nice picture of Jimmy there, and he can be standing still, or he could actually be throwing punches or strikes at me, narrowly missing the camera. I actually felt the wind from some of the strikes, and he came very close to the camera, but it's almost like he's completely static. Okay, so now let's moving over to the Animal IF, and again I have to say this dog is moving at 70 kilometers an hour, and I zoom in and those eyes are bang sharp. Now it may be tracking occasionally and using the subject rather than just the eye. Generally what happens is the eye comes in and out, and but again, if it comes in at the right time, especially as the dog gets very close and the depth of field gets narrower, certainly if it comes in and I get one or two in that sequence when the dog is very close and the eye has it rather than the nose, then the Animal IF will have served its purpose. If you're looking at that static subject, obviously the ability to push back behind the nose when you're shooting with f1.8 or 1.4 lenses is obviously very important. Now I've just got we should have dogs as well as cats. I know a lot of people think, why have we chosen a cat icon instead of a dog icon? Maybe we could customize that later. I digress. What I have on the lower right is the AEL button, which is programmed to a recall custom hold feature. I spent most of the test shooting in AFC, 30 frames per second, and occasionally you don't need those 1/2000th of a second shutter speeds when the dog is sitting on the beach. So I've got the AEL button programmed to recall custom hold 1, which is a shutter priority 1/500th of a second and single shooting. So when I press the shutter release holding down the AEL button, I don't take 30 frames, I just take the 1, and the ISO will obviously stay very low because I'm only using 1/500th of a second rather than 1/2000th of a second. I've got a video on recall custom hold if you need to catch up on that technique. Now if there's going to be one reservation about this Alpha 1 review, it's going to be on this slide. I've got that bird IF enabled. The bird seems to be tracking in the viewfinder really well. When I get to zoom in, I am not seeing the sharpness that I'm used to seeing with either a high resolution camera or the 200-600 lens on an Alpha 9 camera. They may look perfectly acceptable to you on this screen now, but I have to say I've seen sharper, and I think it may be the lens camera combination here, not too sure. Now I will do further testing using the 100-400 lens and other primes, but this is the only reservation. I know there's a few bird photographers out there who want 50 megapixels to be working with that 200-600, but I will have to update you a little bit later. I had to shoot all of these shoots in 60 hours. Some people didn't manage to get out of their living rooms when they tested the camera. We see vases of tulips, and we see their own pet dogs and their family members, and I managed to get out on 7 shoots and organizing people to be on those shoots or permission to get close to the wildlife. So I will test this again, but I did need to release this video early to counteract some of the misinformation. When I switched over to the 135 G Master lens, I had no problems whatsoever. You could see suddenly the sequences were all sharp and very sharp. Now I had great success with the 200-600 on the greyhounds, and they were moving very rapidly, and I had great success with the martial arts, the taekwondo, Jimmy and me there, but it was just the smaller birds moving at a great rate of knots that seemed to lower that quality. Okay, so 30 frames per second on the 135 G Master, all sharp in that sequence. So I've got the choice not to shoot the one that is sharp, but to choose the one that has the best decisive moment, and I've chosen the one bottom left there. And I'm going in, and I have to say that I'm really impressed, and I've cropped into that 4K. So what we're seeing the benefits are of here is that resolution. Dynamic range is also playing a key element here because we've got black feathers, white beak, and sunshine thrown into the mix again, and that is certainly going to push the dynamic range of most sensors. We're working at that 30 frames per second because I'm using the wide AF area. I'm not having to track. The bird IF will occasionally drop in when it can, and it will help me when it can. And so that bird IF will also work with the tracking occasionally if I need it to. Just a word about the tracking. You only really need to use tracking when your subject is likely to go behind another object or subject, and so your object that you're focusing on isn't going to be the one that's closest to the lens anymore. If you've just got wide as your focus area, it will jump to the nearer object. Tracking prevents that from happening. But 90% of the time, doesn't matter whether you're doing motorsports or wildlife, a wide AF area or a zone AF area will do the work or do the job in hand. So we're going in and looking at that eye. I'm pretty sure if the bird had its eye or head facing towards me, I would actually see my own reflection in the eye, and certainly the iris is sharp, and obviously eyelashes are of no concern here. Now this is shot with the 200-600. That the swoop rather than the flapping motion of these large raptors did allow me to track the bird moving. Now as soon as you see birds tracking from left to right or right to left, you really need steady shot on mode 2, not mode 1. That is very important. But here I am doing most of the work. The AF performance of the lens camera is not doing so much work, so it's my ability to pan reasonably accurate. And certainly with the 200-600 now the performance is coming back in as I can track magra from side to side. The camera isn't having to pull focus really quickly on a bird that's coming towards me. So that 200-600 and Alpha 1, just as it was with the Alpha 7 R4, is a little bit of a conundrum. You know, we don't really know what the relationship is between these high resolution cameras and that particular lens, because it doesn't seem to be the lens at fault, because I've seen it perform really well on the Alpha 9 and I've seen it perform really well on the Alpha 7 R3 and the Alpha 9 camera. So we can only just hope for more information further down the track, and maybe a firmware fix for the lens might resolve this. Okay, I did say that I heard that some photographers were using a center fix. I really am pretty sure that whoever is using center fix isn't aware of some of the latest focus assists that we now have with the latest full frame Sony cameras. So before I get into those, let's just say that, you know, Zone would have got this image. I don't need to put a center on a moving target. That's only just going to make the job more difficult in hand. So long as I can avoid picking up the focus on very shallow depth of field of the feet and the GPS tracker, it'll go for the eye. And basically if the eye is in the center of that zone, then the bird IF will take over if it can. And certainly what I would like to do, because I've mentioned that 200-600, is I'm thinking when I next get an opportunity to go out with the camera and shoot birds, thinking of going out with the 100-400. I've had really good performance with the 100-400 on all cameras, and this is an example of that pin sharp image captured with the 100-400. I'm also interested because it is a high resolution camera, and if you're wanting to travel light, a really fast focusing lens which does have that XT linear focus motor is an APS-C lens, because in APS-C mode on the Alpha 1 camera we will get 21 megapixels, which is very respectable. The Canon 1DX Mark III only has 20 megapixels, and that's not in APS-C mode. The other great thing about this very small lens is it has a full frame equivalent view of 105 to 525 millimeters, so certainly a lot of reach for such a small lens. And because the high ISO performance is good, I'm expecting great things. Going back to why wide is a good focus area for Sony cameras. You don't need to be in a center fix or a spot most of the time. Is even if your subject is off to one side, the phase detect autofocus area pretty much covers 92% of the sensor area, so your subject can be pretty much all the way over to one edge and it will still pick up even if it's not in the center of the frame. The algorithms of center and close usually work most of the time, more than 90% of the time, so you don't really need to be chasing things around with small focus points. Okay, there is occasional a reason that those other focus areas do exist for a reason. So if a bird is perched, this was an image captured with the Alpha 9 II. I didn't have the opportunity to capture a bird that was perched and then took flight with the Alpha 1 yet, so I'm using this Alpha 9 II image. And so what we're looking at there, I've put a tracking spot on a bird that's perched. I've put that on the edge of the frame so that when it takes off, I'm not caught by surprise. The bird will be in the center of the frame before I probably start panning and tracking to follow the bird. And so that is a really good use of a focus point put on the edge of the frame. But what we have now is newer features, and these again have been out now for quite a while. It appears on the Alpha 7 R4, the Alpha 9 II, even the Alpha 7C, and that is the ability to use touch operation, touch tracking when we're using the electronic viewfinder. So we could be in the wide focus area, AFC, wide as the focus area, and if we suddenly need to switch over to a tracking option, I don't need to change the focus area by going into the menus or pressing a custom key. All I need to do is, if the touch operation is on and the function of touch operation is set to touch tracking, I just need to put my thumb onto the monitor and drag it to the subject I want to track. Here I'm waiting for the dog on the ground, and again I've positioned it to the left of the frame because it's just about to run to the right of the frame, so I'm going to track it in this instance. I wouldn't really need to track it at all except for what will about to happen in the next slide. But before we go on, there is a new feature which first appeared on the Alpha 7C camera, which is now on the Alpha 1 camera, is the AF on button can be reassigned to AF on and tracking on. So that if you're not ready to start shooting, but you suddenly decide not to use wide focus area but to track the object you're about to follow, just in case it travels behind something else, you do have that option again without changing your focus area. And so this is really, I'm tracking now, and the reason that I'm decided to track rather than just the wide focus area is this dog is going to land on the back of Bo here, and I'm with the wide focus area, it is probably more than likely it will pull focus for 1 or 2 frames on the blue hat. And by having tracking enabled, it ensures that when Rain the dog passes slightly behind the blue hat, the focus will stay with Rain, and certainly that was the case in the sequence. Okay, number 5 was the impact of having 50 megapixel files being captured at 30 frames per second. What does that do to the speed of the workflow? And Alpha 9 users who may be a little bit interested in this question, going, look, I want the megapixels, but if that's going to slow my sports action workflow down, I don't need to be working any slower, otherwise my pitch rater is going to go crazy at me. So the good news, the bottom line here, is it will not. Actually, the workflow is faster than an Alpha 9 II. And so long as you dot your I's and cross your T's on this one. Now the memory card slots will take the older SD-XC2 cards with the 300 read write megabytes per second times there, but if you're going to be clearing the buffer really quickly, you've got to get all of those 240 raw files off onto the card so you can shoot again or eject the card and get somebody backing up that card. You're basically wanting to invest in the CF Express Type A cards, because that tripled the read write times, and so we may have doubled the resolution, but we've tripled the read write times. And also the USB-C port on the side of the camera has also doubled, so when we're offloading those files onto a computer, they're going to be offloaded just as quickly as they were before. So this is really important, obviously, to offload the cards very quickly, because you probably won't go and buy 6 cards straight away, because they do cost a bit of it. They are a bit of an investment. I've just showcased here, if I did take out a full 80 gigabyte CFA Express card, put it into my laptop or this card reader to get over to my laptop, the files would, or the card would transfer all files in just over 1 minute. The important and good news here is a lot of people ask me, when you've got a buffer full of images, can you change any menu settings? This was quite a challenge to do actually. The camera empties its buffer to the card so quickly, you have to be really quick to try and test this to see whether you can change a menu item. And the good news was I couldn't think of anything to change that it wouldn't allow me to change. Typically what I might change is a focus area or the ISO auto minimum shutter speed, or change the subject detection from humans to animals, and that was all happening while it was writing files. Having said that, the files would all be written in a few seconds anyway, and I could have just waited if that had been a problem, but it wasn't. So one of the things, the impacts to your workflow that you will notice is you're going to end up, I ended up with a 1 terabyte worth of files in just 3 days shooting. So you certainly don't want to be transferring that to a laptop that doesn't have 1 terabyte of storage. So you are going to want to use a very fast external SSD hard drive. Now you want to check that can keep up with your CFA Express card, and the one that I'm showing here, the SanDisk, I think it's called a Pro, that can keep up with your laptop and the camera and the card. And so you're trying to identify the weakest link in the chain, and basically it's the card. Even with that triple read write speed, it can push out all of those files to that external card in just over a minute. So a lot of people, when I first mentioned in my preview, I said this camera is as expensive as a Canon 1DX Mark III. It was actually $1 cheaper. Obviously that wasn't an accidental price point that Sony have started with. But then people said, but you're comparing it to the wrong camera, Mark. You should be comparing it to the R5 camera, which is cheaper. And I said, oh, okay. So I don't have a time to go into an in-depth side-by-side comparison. I'm sure somebody out there will do it for you, but just make sure they're giving you a balanced opinion. So what I would like to do is just showcase one important feature that the Alpha 1 does that no other mirrorless camera other than the Alpha 9 cameras currently do, and that is it's using a fully electronic shutter to shoot sports action. That is zero blackout. Now you don't really need zero blackout when you're standing still to shoot a golfer, because you can keep the subject in the view, that's no problem at all, but you do need the absolutely silent shutter. Okay, otherwise shooting this as commercial sports photographer, you'd be asked to put the camera inside a soundproof box, just like photographers do on Hollywood film sets, so as you're not making any noise. The interesting thing, you know, most of the mirrorless cameras have silent shooting mode, but you can't shoot sports action with them because you get shutter distortion. If you look at that image on the left side, that golf club is bent because of shutter distortion. And the Alpha 1 camera has almost zero shutter distortion. It's basically reading the data off that sensor 15 times faster than an R5. Okay, and that's not 5% faster, that's 15 times faster. That is the technology of the stacked backlit illuminated sensor. I was waiting for the second generation to appear after the Alpha 9 cameras, and the Alpha 1 does indeed have the second generation of that landmark groundbreaking sensor design. So here is just looking at the viewfinder alone is the Canon R5 against the Sony Alpha 1, just as a small comparison, because I know a lot of people will not look at the finer details or miss the details. Okay, so zero blackout is a really important one. 240 frames per second refresh rate if you're swinging the camera rapidly in, say, motorsports or birds in flight. The 240 frames per second and the zero blackout is going to double your hit rate altogether. It means the bird isn't halfway out the frame because the blinking is really becoming counterproductive to keeping the bird in the center of the frame. We also have a beautiful high resolution viewfinder when we're not shooting sports action and we don't need that 240 frames per second. You've got a 9.44 million dot resolution, and to be honest, it's as close as it comes to an optical viewfinder. In fact, it's better than an optical viewfinder in that you have all of that information overlay and you get the what you see is what you get view. It also has this amazing big wide field of view when you put your eye to it, so you don't never feel like you're looking down a tunnel at the image at the bottom of that tunnel. So that 0.9 magnification, so it's very impressive when you look at that stacked up against the equivalent Canon R5 settings. So you are getting something for your money, and you're getting in almost every area, I have to say, you're getting something. So just look at that find the frame rate. You can go from set it from high to higher standard, and you can also set the display quality to high if you want those 9.44 million dots. So if you just get it out of the box, I suspect you're not getting the one or the other. You're getting something in the middle, which is probably your high frames per second and a slightly lower resolution. So if you're primarily shooting stills with static subjects, you might want to go for the display quality high, and if you're shooting really rapidly moving stuff, you might want to go for the high plus frames per second. So one might ask, if you were using the fully electronic shutter for shooting sports action, and we're not actually using that shutter for much else, then what is that shutter used for? Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, sounds a bit silly, but it can now be used to keep the sensor clean, so that when you switch the camera off, the shutter closes, so dust will not fall on your sensor. Sony's a bit nervous about implementing this, I have to say, because you must not touch the shutter, just as you should not have touched the sensor, because shutters can be quite fragile. So be very careful not to touch the shutter if you enable this operation. We now no longer have to go into the mechanical shutter to use flash. Okay, so we can use the fully electronic shutter with a maximum sync speed without using high speed sync of 1/200th of a second. So another reason not to go into mechanical shutter. Given that the mechanical shutter is probably the second most expensive component in the camera, you could quite likely see second-hand Alpha 1 cameras coming up for sale in a couple of years of time with just a couple of hundred frames captured with that mechanical shutter. So it's almost the shutter that will probably never wear itself out, even though it's rated at some incredible number of actuations. Why would we actually use that mechanical shutter? Well, Sony have done something else really quite clever, and that is they've raised the fastest sync speed of the mechanical shutter without using high speed sync to 1/400th of a second. Now some people will say, well, really, is there a big difference between using 1/250th and 1/400th? And the answer is yes. It might only appear as like it's just one stop difference in being able to reduce the ambient level of illumination. But when I'm traveling light with my HVL-F45 RM, which is the smaller middle-sized power output flash, it actually on the surface of it now effectively doubles that power. So it now outperforms HVL 60 flash on, say, an Alpha 7 R4 if I'm trying to underexpose the background, so my flash becomes the hero illumination. So top left, I've got an image with no flash at all, and we can see that very bright background. The subject, I didn't have a time to line up a model for this one, so it's my mannequin head, sorry about that. But you can see deep shadow. So what I'd like to do now is to have the flash off camera, okay, off camera, 1/400th of a second sync. Now what I'm doing is I'm underexposing the background level of illumination by 2 stops. Okay, so Great. So what I'm doing now is I'm really darkening that background. So my HVL 45, which is going through a lighting modifier, which is off camera, now has enough power to overpower the background level of illumination. And because the shadows are just a little bit dark, what I'm using to control, or the commander for that off camera flash, I'm using Sony's new HVL F28RM flash there. That should be yep, HVL28RM, and I'm using that as the commander. Now, the interesting thing about this one, this smaller flash doesn't have any LCD screen on it, but you can actually use the monitor on the back of the camera to control and set up the remote flash units that you're controlling. So I've set the on-camera group 1 as -2 stops because I want just a small amount of fill flash from the on-camera flash, and I've set the off-camera flash TTL to +1 EV, and the reason for that is my subject is painted white, and so just the nature of auto exposure is it'll try and set that to grey, and so I'm basically raising it back to white by raising the flash compensation there. So just to go through that again, I know it's a little bit complicated. So ambient light is -2 stops, main flash is +1 stop compensation, and fill flash, which is the commander on the top of the camera, is -2 stops. Some people will get excited about the new touch menus. Okay, this is the second camera after the Alpha 7S3 camera to feature the new touch menus and the whole newly configured menus. Now, some people have said that the new menu configuration is brilliant. It should have been what Sony have done years ago. I have to say it's left me a little bit cold. First of all, I had to go looking for menu items which have moved tabs, and then what I've done is I've set up my menu, the function menu, I've assigned the custom keys, and I'll probably never go into the main menu again. So the fact that we've got touch menus and we've got a new menu layout is something that I will only appreciate once because I don't use menus. Okay, and so what I'm controlling this camera with is a function menu dedicated for the top 12 menu settings. I move for stills, completely different set for movies, and you can if you move from aperture priority to movies, you can have different baseline settings for those without registering memories. And then you've got all of your custom keys you can assign to menus to access very quickly, like I've assigned custom key 3 to ISO auto minimum shutter speed. If you've been using an Alpha 7 camera, you've already acquired 2 extra custom keys because of the hard dial on the top of the left hand side of the camera, focus mode and also drive mode assigned by physical dials. That's basically freed up the left side of the control wheel to be used as a new custom key. So as I said, if you go into the menus, I typically going into format the card. That's about it. Okay, and I've got a lot of information when I do release the ebook on about how to use those trimmed down slim workflows. So if you ever see somebody complaining about Sony's menus ever again, you'll just say, what's all of the fuss about? I always liken it to somebody who's got used to the New York subway system, going and living in London, complaining about London's underground system. But of course, a Londoner would do exactly the same. They would move over to New York and complain about the menus or the subway map when they got to New York. I suppose the burning question at this end of this review is, if you have an Alpha 7R4, is there anything you'll gain from an Alpha 1? And that's a difficult question, as we've looked at before. If you're not using those high ISOs and you value the 60 megapixels rather than having 50 megapixels because you're doing big exhibition prints, or you're an advertising photographer who's trying to avoid purchasing a medium format Hasselblad or Phase 1, then maybe there's nothing to gain from owning an Alpha 1 camera. If you're a sports photographer and you're working for a magazine and 24 megapixels is more than enough, then maybe again the Alpha 1 isn't going to give you anything that you actually need. And if you've recently purchased the Alpha 7S3 and you like shooting movies at ISO 51,200, subjects lit by moonlight, then again you're probably not going to be looking at the Alpha 1. But for somebody who needs a bit of all three, then that's really where the Alpha 1 comes into its own. Like the 50 megapixels does satisfy my need for resolution. Okay, it does satisfy my needs for high ISO performance, and I think when I see the raw files, I'll be vindicated in expressing that opinion a little bit early. So for me, I suspect that the Alpha 7R4 goes. The Alpha 9 II stays until I can get absolute confirmation about working with that 200-600, because I don't own the 400 and 600 mil primes. I'd like to, but my ambassador equipment allowance doesn't stretch to owning those lenses. And then we've got the Alpha 7S3. I actually don't need to shoot things at movies at 51,200. Okay, so I'll just finish on some beautiful images. As I did say, I mean, if you are looking at an in-depth camera review, and I'm sure I've passed the hour mark by now, is you do want to be sure that the photographer you're listening to is a good educator but also a good photographer. You need somebody to have put this camera through its paces, and I hope by showing you these sequences of images and these pin-sharp images of rapidly moving subjects, you will agree with me. This camera is an excellent bit of kit, whether you're using the dog IAF or the bird IAF or not. It's still more than enough to keep up with rapidly moving subjects. And I think I was going to do a whole sequence on things flying, not touching the ground, and this is a camera that could certainly do that, which is why I went out of my way to photograph Bo and his flipping dogs who go catching these frisbees, doing these aerial aerobatics, getting good air off the back of the owner there. So great sequences. And if you looked at all 30 frames in each of these bursts of action, you would realize this is why I need 30 frames a second. And I certainly appreciate anyone who's photographing rackets and balls, bats and balls, anything to do with sports people and balls will also appreciate the 30 frames per second. And also, you're amazing how much difference is between two frames when you're looking at these taekwondo experts. This is Jimmy doing a flying kick here. I was surprised when you look at them in post-production how high he's got off the ground as he's kicking here. And you'll see that again all the sequence is sharp, and this is me doing a flying kick. The top of the kick is released as she's just coming back to earth there, so her toe has just touched the ground as her foot has reached the top of the kick. And as I said, the frame either side is not the decisive moment, so 30 frames per second was certainly serving me well in these instances. And there's me seemingly floating in air and Jimmy getting good air on the pier where I was photographing him work. That is all I have to say, so hopefully you can take the sticky note off my face now and forgive me for not talking fast enough. And if you've enjoyed what I've had to say about the Alpha 1, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and go to my website, markgaylor.com. You will see that all of my learning resources are free to download. I may possibly just have a 450-page ebook for your specific camera, linked to probably 45 video tutorials so you can completely master your camera. Now, I'm not employed as an ambassador to sell products. I'm employed as an ambassador to showcase what these products can do and support the Alpha community. So hopefully you feel supported. I'm Mark Gaylor. I'll catch you online next time.